Okay, hey everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk. Good to see you. Tough act following Vitalik, but I'll do my best. This is a totally different presentation, much less technical. Should be fun. My name is Rettig. I am a core developer, former Ethereum core developer, focused today on a project called Space Mesh. I'm not actually here to talk about Space Mesh in this talk, but I will mention that after 5 years of R&D, the Space Mesh network launched 4 days ago on Bastille Day. So that's very exciting. Please do check it out. Go to spacemesh.io. It's designed around mining from home, which is very exciting. And there's a connection here, which is basically democratization, right? So the reason that I got into the blockchain space years ago is because I believe that these technologies, whether it's Ethereum, Bitcoin, Space Mesh, some of the other stuff we'll talk about here, are really powerful tools to level the playing field in financial participation globally. And so again, that's what Space Mesh is working on via mining from home. And I think the best place in the world to witness this stuff happening today is in the global south, in places like El Salvador. And the technologies that are the most mature today are Bitcoin and Lightning Network, which is what this talk is about. This may sound familiar to some folks in the room, so I gave a longer version of this talk 2 years ago. If these topics are interesting to you, please do consider watching the full video from 2 years ago. If you just put my name in Google or El Salvador and EthCC4, you should find it quite quickly. So it's good to be back. This was a fun tweet. Someone said the best talk at the last, or two EthCCs ago rather, was not about Bitcoin. It was about this topic. So yeah, really excited to be back and kind of fill in the gaps in some of what's happened over the past couple of years. Obviously, just to be clear, this is not a specifically Ethereum-focused talk, but it's adjacent. Let's see. OK, yeah. So what I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes doing is a very brief whirlwind recap of some of the things I covered in the last talk. Again, I have limited time today. I'm going to move through it very quickly, so please do watch that video if the stuff is interesting. I'll share. So I've been to El Salvador twice since that talk. So the main purpose of this talk is to kind of share some of what I learned and saw on the ground in El Salvador. I'll briefly talk about what's going well and what's not going well in El Salvador, and then just conclude with some closing thoughts. So let's start with the recap. OK, so we're going back to 2021 now. This was, I think, June of 2021, when this gentleman, Jack Mallers, he is a Bitcoin developer and entrepreneur, founder of a project called Strike. The Strike app, some of you may be familiar with. It's designed for Lightning payments globally. He gave a talk at Bitcoin 2021 in Miami, where he announced that his project Strike was launching in El Salvador, and even more interestingly, he had been collaborating with the El Salvador government and with Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, on something called a Bitcoin law. And this really was unprecedented. It really came out of the blue. Bukele spoke virtually at this event. This is the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, youngest or second youngest world leader. He's 41, so he's my age. Interesting guy. We'll talk about some reasons why. This is the actual Bitcoin law, so it's just 16 articles. There's an English version of it. It's quite interesting, quite straightforward. I recommend reading it because it is a global first. In a nutshell, it basically makes Bitcoin legal tender in El Salvador for paying government debts, and stipulates that companies that are able to do so have to accept Bitcoin. Was there a date on this? Yeah, so this tweet was on June 9th when it was introduced, and then this is also on June 9th. So things happen very quickly in El Salvador politics, which is also part of this story. So the bill was sent to Congress and approved, I guess, within 24 hours. Kind of a big deal. There were headlines, right? So that's, again, Jack Mallers. And this just says that Bitcoin is now legal tender in El Salvador. So this was June 2021. Crypto Twitter exploded, as you can imagine, with kind of positive and negative commentary, talking about some of the risks, what was happening, and whether this is something that we as a global community of cryptocurrency enthusiasts, blockchain people, Bitcoiners should be supporting or not. And yeah, just a tiny bit of background on El Salvador. It is a small country. It quite literally, like, despite being American and it being kind of in our backyard, so to speak, or being next door, I could not have found it on a map until 2021. It is the smallest country in Latin America. It has about 7 million people, so it's also it's small geographically. It's also relatively small population. It's a very poor country. It's educated, so they have near universal literacy, but more than 70% of the adult population of El Salvador is unbanked. And it's just a difficult country for banks to service because it's very rural and the population is quite poor. It's had an ongoing issue with gangs and violence. So most people who have heard of El Salvador know it primarily as the country in the world that until quite recently had the highest per capita murder rate in the world. So a lot of crime issues. It had its own sovereign currency called the colon, named after Christopher Columbus, that in 2001 was forcibly converted into dollars. This will come back into the story in a moment. There's been a lot of corruption and a lot of anger, understandably, against the corruption. So 3 of the last 3 presidents are in prison for corruption. And this explains a bit about Nayib Bukele's story and kind of how he came to power. The way he describes it, before him and before his new party that he launched, the country had a corrupt left-wing party and a corrupt right-wing party, and that was the choice that people had. And he started a party called New Ideas, Nuevos Ideas, that has become very, very, very popular. He's been called the president who governs his country through Twitter. So he's very active on Twitter and TikTok, and just as a millennial, very active in social media, and one of the first world leaders to really use it very effectively. But there's one interpretation of his actions, which is that he's quite authoritarian and is not pro-democracy. And a number of the kind of things that he's done could be interpreted in that light. And there's a lot of pressure on him on the part of the United States and other countries to not slide further into the direction of authoritarianism and dictatorship and to promote democracy. But as is usually the case in real-world politics, it's complicated. So one example of this is he actually marched the army into Congress to coerce legislators into passing some legislation that was favorable to his party in 2021, although the government has effectively apologized for it and said that that was a mistake at the time. But this is the kind of thing people are worried about. At the same time, there's this very active Bitcoin community that got started in El Salvador around 4 years ago or so a year or 2 before kind of this whole Bitcoin law story starts. And it's primarily centered in a small town called El Zonte, otherwise known as Bitcoin Beach. It's a tiny community. It's a surfing community with a few thousand people in it. And I visited there, so I'll show some photos from that. And starting with the work of just a couple of local Bitcoiners and entrepreneurs, this kind of circular Bitcoin economy got bootstrapped and got going. And it's quite unique in the world. There's very few places where you can and I've experienced this myself, just kind of live on Bitcoin, use Lightning wallets to kind of pay for everyday goods and services. People are happy to be paid in Bitcoin because they know they can spend it in the circular economy. And then I think the final piece of the story, just catching up, this is still all stuff that happened prior to 2021, my previous talk, is that Bukele and the government introduced their own government wallet called Chivo. Chivo means, it's local slang for kind of cool. And they introduced an incentive, which was $30 in Bitcoin to any Salvadorian who downloaded the app. And we'll get back to this in a moment as well. But this is kind of their strategy for onboarding people to Bitcoin. This is just another a larger image of the same Bitcoin law. Cool. OK, so part 2, I'll just share some personal kind of anecdotes and stories from my trips to El Salvador. So this is kind of now moving into the update portion of the talk. So I first visited in the end of August / beginning of September of 2021. So that was a couple of months after the last talk, and it was actually the same week that the Bitcoin law came into effect. And I wanted to just be there on the ground and talk to people, because seeing Twitter headlines and seeing things in the news is one thing. I wanted to actually meet people face to face and hear their stories and hear kind of how they feel about Bitcoin. And so we did this kind of thing. We wandered around the streets. If this is still the capital, this is San Salvador, buying hot dogs, buying pupusas, which is a local delicacy, and just trying to pay with Bitcoin everywhere. There's a little $10, I think, immigration tax you have to pay when you land at the airport. You can now pay that in Bitcoin, so we kind of tried to do that in Bitcoin. We tried to buy our coffee with Bitcoin. We tried to buy things from street vendors in Bitcoin, and almost no one accepted it at that point in time outside of Bitcoin Beach. Yeah, I mean, these are just some more photos from the trip. So this gentleman that we're interviewing here is a driver. That's his profession, and I'll speak again more about this towards the end, but we just ask people about their personal family stories, how they feel about the kind of economic situation and how they feel about Bitcoin and if it's like having a positive or negative impact on their lives. The gentleman on the left is Alejandro Machado. Some of you may know who he is, co-founder of the Open Money Initiative, close friend, native Spanish speaker. He's Venezuelan, and so he kind of like led this particular research trip, and it's a topic that he's been researching for a very long time. Large vendors, right? So the Starbucks, Wendy's, McDonald's, et cetera, do accept Bitcoin. And we were able to use it successfully in a number of these kind of chain-type locations. And it's pretty cool to see this all over the country. And most of the time, the point-of-sale system works well, and you just scan a QR code using a Lightning app. If you have used Lightning at all, and first of all, if you haven't, I encourage you to try it. It's become quite mature and quite usable. But there are some kinks that are still being worked out. And one of them is that not every Lightning app is compatible with every other Lightning app yet. So things worked most of the time, but not completely seamlessly. I guess this is just, I'm wearing the same shirt. I own more than one shirt, I promise. But yeah, shout out to Daoist. So this is, yeah, just proof of having visited Bitcoin Beach. El futuro está aquí, quite exciting. This is the Mama Rosa's pupuseria. So this is the place where it all started. One of the Bitcoin entrepreneurs that I mentioned earlier, his mother runs just a small restaurant, a small operation, in El Zonte, serving the local population, local food. And it was a really wonderful experience to meet her. I think I have a photo. Oh, OK, I don't include that photo, unfortunately. Interviewing her about her story and how this all happened. So there is a Bitcoin Beach community, a set of really incredible people who are focused on education. And so we traveled around the region with them. They were kind enough to invite us along. And so this is a village maybe 30, 45 minutes away from El Zonte, where we are meeting the local residents and onboarding them to the Bitcoin Beach wallet and making their first Bitcoin transaction. This was, I mean, for someone who spends nearly all of my time in big Western wealthy countries, it was really, really exciting and eye-opening to experience this on the ground. And for anyone who's interested in doing this sort of work, talk to me. I can connect you to the Bitcoin Beach people. It's really important work that they're doing, and they've onboarded a lot of people in El Salvador, and the community is growing. So here's just a few more images of working with the folks in that particular community and onboarding them. I wish I had more time to talk about the experience and the challenges, like the fact that they're running ancient Android phones and they have no data on their phones, and we had to hotspot them and stuff. So it was, yeah, not just linguistic challenges, but lots of other challenges. But very rewarding, and I learned a lot. This is Carla. She works at a coffee shop in Zonte, in Bitcoin Beach. And the coffee shop accepts Bitcoin, but what she previously did not know how to do is, number one, moving Bitcoin into stablecoins to protect the value. And number two, how to just accept tips directly in Bitcoin. And so here we're onboarding her to a couple of Bitcoin wallet apps and to the ability to move things back and forth to stablecoins. And a very fun thing happened. We tweeted a QR code for her tip wallet, and it got retweeted and passed around in the Bitcoin community. And over the following days, something like $6,000 or $7,000 US worth of Bitcoin flowed into her account. And that's a life-changing amount of money in a country where the average monthly salary is like $100 or something. And so we were showing her, if you want to move a portion of this into something dollar-denominated, here's how you do that. Again, I wish I had more time to share more about that story, but it's a really incredible story. And I think it's included in a documentary that was made about the Bitcoin story in El Salvador. This was just a shot from my more recent trip. So I was there again a few months ago. I'm wearing an Urbit hat. It was part of an Urbit event, so shout out to Urbit as well. And I'm here paying for entry to a national park using Bitcoin. And I thought that was cool because, again, I couldn't use Bitcoin everywhere. But anything that touches the government, whether it's the immigration, whether it's your taxes, whether it's a national park, it works. And I mean, I know it's not clear from this photo, but I'm hours outside the Capitol on a mountain here, barely have any reception on my phone. You know, I barely speak Spanish, this gentleman barely speaks English, and yet the fact that we're able to kind of transact on the same network and both speaking Bitcoin, I think is pretty remarkable. All right, I'm a little short on time, so I'll move through this pretty quickly. What's going well in El Salvador? Well, the biggest thing that's going well is a reduction in crime. And there's a lot of headlines about this that I mentioned earlier. El Salvador had the highest murder rate, the highest per capita murder rate in the world a few years ago. That's come down substantially. I mean, to a great degree. I don't know the exact number, but it's 98%, something on that order. And so if you read these articles about El Salvador, you'll see lines like this. And I, by the way, again, this is a newspaper, but I was there recently, and I spoke to people recently on the ground, and they told me similar stories. I met ladies who said that they would never have contemplated going out alone at night to the market, any of this stuff, and they now feel safe in their own neighborhoods for the first time in their lives. And so that's huge, right? I mean, that's a massive improvement in the quality of life. These are some slides from a survey that was done recently, and this says, do you believe that crime is reduced, increased, or about the same under the current government? And 88.2% believe that crime is reduced. This just says, I mean, I think most of you can figure this out, right? The government represents positive change, right? 83.3%. Negative change, very small number. Has the government, do you believe the government has been able to control crime in the country? And again, like, overwhelmingly positive feedback. Bukele is very, very, very popular. I believe his party took, again, something like 90% of the vote in a recent election, which is deemed free and fair. And so that just cannot be understated. He has, I believe, the highest approval rating of any head of state anywhere in the world right now. And this is, you have to understand, this is the reason why. This is a country where, within recent living memory, basically everyone I spoke to has family members who had been arrested, who had been, sorry, not been arrested, who had been captured by gangs, who had been held ransom, who had been kidnapped, and who had been killed, even tortured. And that's really turned around completely in the span of a few years. Something else that's improved is the number of Bitcoin ATMs. So I showed this slide 2 years ago. At that point in time, there were 2 Bitcoin ATMs in 2021 in El Salvador, and the fees were very high. This is what it looks like today. There's 212. That's really remarkable change, again, for a period of 2 years. And this is some of the best coverage in the world. And keep in mind as well, El Salvador is a very rural country once you get outside San Salvador. So some of these places on this map are very remote villages. This is what the ATMs look like. I mentioned Chivo before. So the government hired a foreign company, I think it may be a French company, I might be wrong about that, called Athena, to build the software behind the Chivo wallet and the Chivo ATMs. And I used one when I was there recently. I spent a grand total of $2 to buy Bitcoin. So I bought 9,000 sats, 9,671 satoshis. But it worked, and it was a pretty cool experience. It took about 60 seconds. Put the cash in, put in a Bitcoin address, or scan a QR code, and get the Bitcoin in the wallet with very low fees, or basically no fees. So as Bukele says, they've onboarded, this is already old, this is from more than a year ago, but they had already onboarded more than 4 million out of 6.5 million people. It's very remarkable, impressive numbers. Again, I wish I had more time to go into this in detail, but they've also recently passed a digital asset law, which is also known as a DAO law. So they've now have a legal structure on the ground if you want to create a DAO with a connection, with legal protection and legal recognition under the government. El Salvador is a place you can consider doing that right now. So this is a huge step forward. I know folks who have gone down there to do that. A lot of Bitcoin entrepreneurs are pouring money into the country to do things like mining. So those are all positives. The negatives, El Salvador has obviously cracked down on crime in a big way, but there's been a cost associated with it. So this is a New York Times headline from a couple months ago. One of the ways they've done that is by building one of the largest prisons in the world. And Bukele is famous for regularly tweeting photos and videos of this sort of thing, like thousands and thousands of prisoners, stripped down, piled together like this. Here's an image of the prison, 40,000 person prison. This figure really struck me when I read it. So nearly 2% of the entire adult population of El Salvador. It's not just men, like male population. This is the entire adult population is now in prison, which is, on par with the United States. And it's not something that we're proud of, not something we should be proud of, but it's among the highest in the world. And there's been a lot of pushback against the way that detentions have worked with no habeas corpus, very little accountability, and the authorities saying things like, we can arrest anyone we want to, which is quite sad and quite scary. There's also, this is a report from the United States government, sanctions actually, which has sanctioned the El Salvador government, saying that the Bukele administration actually bribed, provided financial incentives, that's translated as bribes, the gangs to reduce the violence. And so there's some collusion going on there as well, potentially. And there have been, some quite critical negative headlines as well about the Bitcoin rollout. I don't have time to read through all of these. But a key point is that less than 2% of remittances are flowing through Bitcoin. And the whole goal of Chivo, they deployed Chivo ATMs across the United States as well, which has a large migrant Salvadorian population sending money home. Only 2% are flowing through that network today using Bitcoin. It's just another headline. This is a guest essay by a Salvadorian. Most people don't feel that Bitcoin is beneficial for them. It's largely not an accepted medium of exchange in El Salvador, in spite of the promotion on the part of the government. Created a measly 111 jobs, like crypto startups in El Salvador to date. So real research is beginning to be done on this topic, and this is a research paper that talks about how the usage of digital payments in Bitcoin is low and concentrated, and it's been decreasing over time. So while it's true that 4 million Salvadorians may have claimed their $30 bonus, very few of them are actually using Bitcoin on a day-to-day basis. And this was also what I found in my research and interviews. Again, this question of democracy versus authoritarianism. So under Bukele, the Supreme Court dropped the presidential term limit law, and so there's a chance that he may stick around longer than he would have otherwise, so we'll see what happens in the next election cycle. Yeah, and I'll just conclude now very briefly with a couple thoughts, a couple closing thoughts. So this is another slide from the same survey that I shared earlier, and what this one says is the government passed the Bitcoin law the previous year. To what extent has it benefited your family economic situation? In other words, is it good for you and the people close to you? And as you can see, 71% say zero, not at all. And a pretty small percentage of people feel that Bitcoin is benefiting them. And there have been a lot of protests against Bitcoin. Literally, we saw this when we were there as well. Fire in the streets, and some of those ATMs I showed you got lit on fire as well. And just going back to a slide I showed earlier, when we speak to everyday Salvadorians, the message that came across is that, look, money is about trust, okay? The reason that pieces of paper in our pockets, our credit cards, our ETH, our BTC, our USDC, your DAI, whatever your currency of choice is, right? The reason that those things have value, and the reason we can spend them and hold them and know they'll keep value is because of trust. Trust in each other, trust in the government. And El Salvadorians don't have trust in their government, and this is particularly true because of the forced dollarization that happened in 2001. And they're very skeptical that this is not just a plot on the part of the government to take money from everyday people and benefit the wealthy. And so I think a lot of work remains to be done to show people that Bitcoin is different and cryptocurrency is different and can benefit everyday people. I showed this quote last time, I'm showing it again, right? Creating money is easy. It takes literally 60 seconds to create an ERC20 coin. But to convince people to trust it and use it, again, a lot of work remains to be done there. Yeah, again, this is just the colon. This is the previous currency. And if you're from El Salvador, if you're from Argentina, if you're from Venezuela, Zimbabwe, North Korea, many of these countries, it's easy to abuse the money system. And yeah, we have, I guess the key message I'd like you to take home is that as people building these networks and these systems, technical, social, we have a lot of work to do to show people how and why they're trusted. And it comes back to things like credible neutrality. Yeah, I showed this last time as well. Always have to have some memes in there. So yeah, I think El Salvador has an interesting, exciting future ahead of it. I think my closing thought is that, as I said last time, we should be skeptical and vigilant, and we should make sure that democratic norms are not ignored in the process, but we should remain hopeful and optimistic. I think that what El Salvador is doing is exciting, and we should all be paying attention to it. Hopefully it's a good deal. Thank you so much. We don't have time for questions, right? Okay.